The strange thing about love is that sometimes the whole town can see it except the two people standing inside it. In the summer of 1883, there was not a single soul in Red Creek, Wyoming, who would have been surprised if Emma Bennett had chosen a husband. Men had been trying for years. Some came with flowers, some came with promises, some came with land, cattle, money, and dreams of comfortable futures. Yet every one of them eventually rode away disappointed, not because Emma was cruel, quite the opposite. She had a way of making people feel seen, a way of listening that made even the shyest person believe their words mattered. At 26, Emma had become the heart of Red Creek. People visited her father's mercantile for supplies, but many stayed simply because Emma was there. Her laughter could brighten a room. Her kindness could settle an argument, and her smile had started more than one foolish man's journey toward heartbreak. Naturally, the town had theories. Some believed she was waiting for a wealthy rancher. Others thought she wanted to leave Wyoming altogether. A few insisted she secretly loved someone in another territory. None of them knew the truth. The truth was standing less than 3 blocks away most days, and his name was Ethan Walker. Unfortunately for Emma, Ethan had absolutely no idea. Ethan owned a small blacksmith shop near the edge of town. He was 30 years old and lived alone in a modest cabin behind the forge. Most people would never call him remarkable. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous. He wasn't the kind of man who entered a room and stole everyone's attention, but there was something steady about him, something dependable. If a widow needed her wagon repaired and couldn't pay, Ethan somehow found a way to help. If a ranch hand was injured, Ethan was usually among the first men to arrive. When the church roof collapsed after a winter storm, Ethan spent 3 weekends helping rebuild it without accepting a single dollar. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. That was simply who he was. Emma had noticed that long ago. She had noticed it when they were teenagers. She had noticed it when they became friends. And she had noticed it every day since. The problem was that Ethan looked at her the way a man might look at a beautiful sunset. He appreciated it, admired it, enjoyed seeing it, but never once imagined it could belong to him. One warm June morning, Ethan stepped into the mercantile to buy horseshoe nails. Emma was standing on a stool, reaching for a sack of flour on the highest shelf. A loose strand of golden hair had escaped from behind her ear. For a brief second, Ethan simply watched. Then he smiled. "Morning, Emma." She looked down and smiled back. "Morning, Ethan." The simple exchange should have felt ordinary. Instead, it made Emma's heart ache. Because, after all these years, that was still where they lived. "Morning, Emma." "Morning, Ethan." Always close, never closer. She climbed down from the stool while Ethan paid for his supplies. For a moment, she considered saying something, anything, something that might push the conversation somewhere new. Instead, she remained silent, and a few minutes later, he tipped his hat and left. Just like always, outside he nearly collided with Samuel Reed. Samuel had once spent 6 months trying to court Emma before finally accepting defeat. He glanced through the store window toward Emma and then back at Ethan. A slow smile appeared on his face. "You know," Samuel said, "I've met smarter horses than you." Ethan blinked. "What?" Samuel shook his head. "Never mind." Then he walked away laughing. Ethan stood there confused. Inside the store, Emma watched through the window and wondered how much longer she could keep pretending patience wasn't. Exhausting, summer rolled forward, the days grew hotter, the town became busier. And quietly, without anyone realizing it, a clock had started ticking. His name was Richard Hale. At 43, Richard owned the largest cattle ranch in the county. He was respected, successful, confident, a man who usually got what he wanted. When Richard entered a room, people noticed. When he made decisions, people listened. And recently he had begun asking questions about Emma Bennett. Careful questions, serious questions, the kind a man asked before deciding whether he intended to marry. Emma first noticed him watching her during the Red Creek Summer Social held in late July. The dance hall was crowded. Music drifted through the warm evening air. Couples filled the floor. Emma accepted several dances because refusing would have been rude. She smiled. She laughed. She played the role everyone expected, but her attention kept drifting elsewhere toward the far wall, toward Ethan. He had arrived late, still dusty from the forge. One sleeve rolled higher than the other, hair slightly messy. Completely unaware that half the women in town secretly preferred him exactly that way, he wasn't dancing. He was simply standing near the refreshments table talking with friends. Then suddenly he looked across the room. Their eyes met. And for one beautiful second, everything else disappeared. Emma smiled. Not the smile she gave everyone, his smile, the private one. The one she never showed anybody else. Ethan smiled back. Then someone tapped his shoulder. He turned away, and the moment vanished. Emma's chest tightened. Across the dance floor, Richard Hale noticed everything: the smile, the glance, the disappointment that followed. And for the first time, he began to suspect there might be another man standing between him and the future he wanted. 3 days later, Emma sat on her parents' porch while her father cleaned tools nearby. The evening sun painted the mountains gold. After several minutes of silence, her father finally spoke. "Richard Hale came by today." Emma immediately knew why. Her stomach tightened. "He asked about you." She stared toward the distant hills. Her father continued carefully. "He's thinking seriously." A long silence followed. Then Emma asked quietly, "Do you think he's a good man?" "I do." Another silence. "But he's not Ethan." Emma closed her eyes. Her father sighed softly. "No, he's not." The words hung between them, heavy, honest, painfully true. For years she had waited. For years she had hoped. For years she had believed Ethan would eventually see what everyone else already knew. But now, for the first time, she felt fear. Real fear. Not fear of Richard. Not fear of marriage. Fear that the man she loved might never gather the courage to reach for something he believed was beyond him. And as the sun disappeared behind the Wyoming mountains, Emma Bennett finally began to wonder whether waiting forever was no longer an option. Far across town, Ethan worked alone inside his forge, unaware that another man was preparing to change everything, unaware that time was beginning to run out, and completely unaware that the woman he loved had almost reached the end of her patience. The news reached Ethan Walker on a Monday morning, not through gossip, not through rumor, but through a friend who had finally grown tired of watching a blind man walk past his own future. Samuel Reed arrived at the forge shortly after sunrise. Ethan was replacing a broken wagon axle when Samuel stepped inside and leaned against the doorway. For several moments he said nothing. He simply watched Ethan work. Finally he spoke. "Richard Hale is planning to ask Emma Bennett to marry him." The hammer stopped in midair. The forge crackled behind him. Ethan slowly looked up. "What?" Samuel folded his arms. "You heard me." Ethan stared. The words felt strange, uncomfortable, like a stone inside his chest. Richard Hale. Emma. Marriage. The three things refused to fit together. "Where'd you hear that?" "From people who would know." Samuel stepped closer. "He's serious, Ethan." The forge suddenly felt hotter. Ethan looked away. "Well," he said carefully, "that's none of my business." Samuel laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was unbelievable. "You're impossible." Ethan frowned. "What does that mean?" Samuel stared at him for a long moment, then he shook his head. "Ethan, every man in this county knows Emma Bennett has turned down more offers than anyone can count. So maybe ask yourself why." Ethan said nothing. The silence stretched. Finally Samuel sighed. "Good Lord." He pointed directly at him. "Because of you." The words landed harder than any hammer blow. Ethan blinked. "What are you talking about?" Samuel's patience finally broke. "I'm talking about Emma Bennett spending years looking at you like you're the only man in Wyoming." The forge became very quiet. Outside, a horse whinnied somewhere down the street. Inside, Ethan simply stared. Samuel continued. "Every dance, every social, every church gathering, every Sunday, she's been waiting." Ethan felt something shifting inside him, something he had ignored for years. Moments, small moments. Her smile when she saw him, the way she always seemed happy when he arrived, the way conversations lasted longer than they needed to, the way she remembered every little thing he ever mentioned. Suddenly, none of those memories looked the same. Samuel stepped toward the door. "I've said what I came to say." Then he stopped. "One last look. If you're going to do something, do it soon." And then he left. Ethan stood motionless. The forge fire crackled. The morning sunlight stretched across the floorboards. But inside his head, everything had changed. For years he had convinced himself Emma Bennett was beyond him. Too beautiful, too admired, too special. The kind of woman a man like Richard Hale should marry. Not a blacksmith with rough hands and soot on his sleeves. Yet now another possibility refused to leave him. What if he had been wrong? What if everyone else had seen something he never allowed himself to believe? What if Emma had been waiting all this time? And what if she stopped waiting? The thought hit harder than anything, because suddenly the possibility of losing her felt unbearable. 3 days later, Ethan saw her walking down Main Street. The afternoon was warm. Dust drifted through the sunlight. Emma carried a small basket from the mercantile. When she spotted him outside the forge, her face immediately brightened, just as it always did. Only now he noticed, really noticed. She crossed the street. "Afternoon, Ethan. Afternoon, Emma." For a moment they spoke about ordinary things. The weather, the coming harvest, a stubborn horse belonging to one of the ranchers. Normal conversation, safe conversation. The kind they had always shared. But Ethan could feel something pressing against his ribs, something demanding to be said. Because for the first time in years, silence felt dangerous. Emma noticed his expression. "You seem serious." He looked down briefly, then back at her, and suddenly there was no easy way to avoid it. No joke, no distraction, no excuse. Just the truth. "Emma." The sound of her name made her heartbeat quicken. Something in his voice had changed. The street around them seemed to disappear. Ethan swallowed. "I heard about Richard Hale." She became very still. "He's considering making an offer." Emma nodded slowly. "Yes." A long silence followed. Then Ethan spoke again. "I don't have any right to ask you not to consider him." Her eyes never left his, but his chest tightened. Years of hesitation, years of doubt, years of believing she could never belong to him. All of it suddenly felt foolish. "I need to tell you something before you make any decisions." Emma's fingers tightened around the basket handle. The world seemed to stop moving. Ethan took a breath, then another, and finally the truth came, not perfectly, not elegantly, but honestly. "For years I convinced myself you were too good for me." His voice was quiet. "I thought every other man in town had something better to offer." He looked directly at her. Land, money, status. A sad smile touched his face, so I never said anything. Emma felt tears threatening behind her eyes, not from sadness, from hope. Ethan continued. "But the thought of losing you." He stopped, gathered himself, then finished. "The thought of watching someone else build a life with you is the worst thing I've ever imagined." The basket nearly slipped from Emma's hands. For years she had dreamed about hearing these words, and now they were finally here. Ethan stepped closer, his voice softer now. "I love you." The words hung between them. Simple, honest, real. "I think I've loved you for a long time." His eyes never left hers. "I was just too afraid to admit it." Emma stared at him. The dusty street blurred. The sounds of town faded. All she could see was Ethan. Finally, after all these years, finally a smile appeared through her tears. Then she took one step closer, close enough that nobody else could hear her, and in a voice barely above a whisper she said, "Ethan." His heart pounded. She smiled. The smile she had been saving for him alone. Then she spoke the words she had carried inside her heart for years. "I've saved my heart for you." Ethan froze. Emma's eyes glistened. Every offer, every dance, every man. She shook her head gently. "It was always you." For a moment neither of them moved. The years between them seemed to disappear. All the waiting, all the uncertainty, all the missed chances, gone. Then Emma looked at him with a mixture of hope and challenge, the way only a brave woman can, and softly she added, "Just don't make me wait any longer." The words struck directly at his heart, and for the first time in his life, Ethan Walker stopped standing still. He took a step toward her. Ethan Walker had spent years believing some dreams belonged to other men. That belief disappeared the moment Emma Bennett told him she had saved her heart for him. The next morning he woke before sunrise. For several minutes he sat on the edge of his bed, staring through the cabin window toward the sleeping town. Everything looked the same. The mountains, the streets, the rooftops. Yet nothing felt the same anymore, because for the first time in years he knew exactly what he wanted, and he was done pretending otherwise. By 8 o'clock he was standing inside Bennett Mercantile wearing his cleanest shirt. His boots had been polished, his hair had actually been combed, a rare event that would have shocked most of Red Creek. Daniel Bennett looked up from the counter. One glance told him everything. The shirt, the nervous expression, the determination. Daniel fought back a smile, then he called toward the back room, "Emma, Ethan Walker's here." Footsteps sounded immediately. A second later, Emma appeared. She stopped when she saw him, and the look that passed between them made Daniel suddenly become very interested in a nearby shelf. Neither of them looked away. Neither needed to. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'd like to start calling on you properly." Emma's smile grew. "I was wondering how long that would take." Daniel coughed loudly, mostly to hide his amusement. Ethan looked at him. "And I'd like your permission." Daniel nodded once. "You have it." Simple, direct, exactly the way frontier men handled important things. Emma looked at Ethan. "You know, most men bring flowers." Ethan glanced at his empty hands. A look of horror crossed his face. Emma laughed. The sound immediately filled the store. "I'll bring them tomorrow," he promised. "You'd better." "I will." Her smile softened. "And Ethan, yeah?" "Don't be late," he smiled. Never again. Word traveled through Red Creek faster than a prairie wildfire. Within 2 days, everyone knew. Within 4 days, everyone was discussing it. Within a week, half the town acted as though they had personally arranged the entire romance. The loudest celebration came from Samuel Reed. When he learned Ethan had finally confessed, he reportedly removed his hat and thanked heaven for ending what he called the longest misunderstanding in Wyoming history. The courtship that followed became the most talked about in town, not because it was dramatic, because it felt real. Every morning Ethan found a reason to stop by the Mercantile. Sometimes he brought flowers. Sometimes he brought fresh apples. Once he brought a pie that looked as though it had survived a wagon accident. Emma laughed so hard she cried before eating every bite anyway. They attended church together, shared Sunday suppers, took evening walks along the edge of town, and for the first time, neither of them had to pretend their favorite person was simply a friend. One golden September afternoon, they rode into the hills overlooking the valley. The grass stretched endlessly beneath the Wyoming sky. Mountains rose in the distance. The air smelled of pine in late summer. They sat together on a ridge watching sunlight move across the land. After a long silence, Ethan spoke. "Can I ask you something?" Emma leaned against a nearby rock. "Of course, why me?" She smiled immediately. "As if you don't know. I honestly don't." She studied him. The same steady man she had loved for years. The same man who never understood his own worth. Finally, she answered, "Because you're real." Ethan frowned slightly. "What does that mean?" "It means every other man tried to show me something." She looked across the valley. Their money, their cattle, their land, their importance. Then she looked directly at him. "You never showed me anything." A small smile appeared. "You just showed up." Ethan was quiet. Emma continued. "You were always the same person, kind on good days, kind on bad days, honest when nobody was looking, helpful when nobody could repay you." She shook her head gently. "That's rare." The wind moved softly across the ridge. For several moments, Ethan said nothing. Then he reached for her hand. "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." Emma squeezed his fingers. "No." A smile touched her lips. "We're the best thing that's happened to each other." By October, everyone knew what was coming, including Emma, including Daniel and Ruth Bennett, including practically every resident of Red Creek. The only question was when. The answer arrived on a cool autumn evening after the Harvest Festival. The town square had mostly emptied. Lantern light flickered across the wooden buildings. The air carried the first hint of winter. Ethan walked Emma home. When they reached the mercantile steps, he stopped. His heart immediately began racing. Emma noticed. A slow smile appeared. "Ethan?" He reached into his pocket. For 2 weeks he had carried his grandmother's ring, waiting, searching for the perfect moment. Finally he realized something. Perfect moments don't arrive, you create them. He pulled out the ring. Emma's breath caught. "Ethan." He took her hand. "I spent years being afraid." His voice shook slightly. "I spent years believing you were beyond my reach." The ring glimmered under the lantern light. "But I'm done being afraid." His eyes met hers. "I love you, Emma Bennett." The world seemed to disappear. "I love your laugh. I love your kindness. I love the way you make every room feel warmer." A pause. "And I'd love to spend the rest of my life making sure you never doubt how much you mean to me." The ring rested in his palm. "Will you marry me?" Emma stared at him. Tears filled her eyes. For years she had imagined this moment. Now it was finally real. A laugh escaped her, followed by a tearful smile. Then she said the easiest words she had ever spoken. "Yes." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Relief flooded through him. When he opened them again, Emma was smiling through tears. The ring slipped perfectly onto her finger, and for the first time in years, there was nothing left unsaid. They married in November before the first heavy snow. The church overflowed with people, friends, neighbors, ranchers, merchants, cowboys. Everyone wanted to witness the wedding they had secretly hoped for all along. Emma wore her mother's dress. Ethan couldn't stop looking at her. As she walked down the aisle, one thought repeated itself inside his head. "I almost missed this. One more month. One more mistake. One more moment of hesitation. And everything could have been different." The realization stayed with him long after the wedding. Years later, it still remained. Their life together was not perfect. No life ever is, but it was good, wonderfully good. They built a home filled with laughter, filled with honesty, filled with the quiet comfort that comes from loving your best friend. A son arrived first, a daughter followed later. The house became louder, messier, happier. One summer evening, 6 years after their wedding, Ethan came home from the blacksmith shop and found Emma hanging laundry in the golden sunset. The mountains glowed behind her. The children argued somewhere inside the house. Emma looked up and caught him staring. A familiar smile appeared. "You're doing it again." Ethan walked closer. "Doing what?" "Staring," he laughed softly. "Can you blame me?" Emma shook her head. "You never used to stare." Ethan wrapped his arms around her. Then he whispered the truth that had taken him far too long to learn. "I used to think you were too beautiful for me." Emma looked up. The same beautiful eyes, the same smile. The same woman he would choose 1,000 times. "And now?" she asked. Ethan kissed her forehead. "Now I know the luckiest thing that ever happened to me wasn't finding you." He smiled. "It was finally finding the courage to walk toward you." Emma rested her head against his chest. The evening sun painted the Wyoming sky gold. The children laughed inside the house. And Ethan held the woman who had once waited patiently for him to see what had been in front of him all along. The woman who had quietly saved her heart for him. The woman who had been worth every step. And as the sun disappeared beyond the mountains, both of them knew something simple and true. The greatest love stories are not always about finding the right person. Sometimes they're about finally having the courage to stop waiting and tell the truth. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the right person has been waiting for you all along.